Thanks to Michael for leading us in that song service. He didn't know this, but seeking the lost is apropos to our lesson today. It's a scary thing to think I'm reading his mind or he's reading mine. We do want to keep Mitchell and Gayla in our prayers. They are in Thailand, as you know, and we want to bring up their name in prayer as often as we can, that they're safe while they're there and safe getting back. And we appreciate their work and the work of their family and all that they're doing in Thailand, and we want them to, we want Mitchell and Gayla to get home safely. I also want to thank the elders for the opportunity to preach this morning and bring a lesson to you. I've got special guests back here today. Avon and Robbie are here, and there is Adelaide sitting with Bunny. And I'm just going to sit here the rest of the morning and stare at Adelaide, I think. You guys can read the lesson for yourselves. No, she's precious. She informed us last night that Jesus' best friend was her daddy, Robbie. And so I offered to let Robbie preach this morning since he had inside information. But Robbie declined. That's okay. That's okay. On May the 10th, 1940, Germany invaded Belgium, and Belgium capitulated 18 days later. Germany occupied Belgium for almost 5 years during World War II, and then in February 4, 1945, Belgium was fully liberated from German occupation. The Church of Christ had been in Belgium, but right near and after Victory in Europe Day, Churches of Christ sent a vanguard of missionaries into the European continent. The patriarch of a lot of that work was Brother Otis Gatewood, who spent most of his time working in Germany. But there were others, such as Brother Timmerman, whom I don't know much about, honestly, that started a church in a little Belgian community in Liège, or Liège in French. It was a French-speaking community called Pepinster. Pepinster is still there today. It's about the size of Crossville. Its population is about the same size as Crossville, but Brother Timmerman started a church right after the Germans left. And he was primarily occupied, of course, at first with benevolence. There was great desperation. There was great need. It was wintertime. People needed just basics, food, water, something to keep them warm at night. But over time, it branched out from that into evangelism, into more preaching and teaching. He was overseen by the Church of Christ at Sherman Street in Denver, Colorado. Again, I don't know anything about that congregation or even if it's still there today. I was going through some of my grandmother's personal effects. She passed away a few years ago, and we'd cleaned out her house. And as often goes in things like that, there were boxes of things that we didn't have time to go through, and they ended up in her garage, and then they ended up in a storage unit, and then they ended up in my garage. And last month, we had to clean out the storage unit, so I started through some of those boxes. And in one of those boxes, I found a postcard. Now, for most of you who are under 30, you may not know what a postcard is in our digital world. But at one time, they were very useful. They were highly prized souvenir items. I know Carol Ann's father, Dal, he traveled the world preaching and teaching literally in Africa and Asia and Europe. But everywhere he would go, he would pick up postcards, big stack of postcards. They were cheap, they were easy to travel with, easy to pack, and it had all the tourist attractions, printed on them. And so that was his way of picking up souvenirs. And sometimes for Christmas, you get a postcard from Tokyo, but actually he was in Henderson. He was just using his postcards to say Merry Christmas, But I found a postcard, and the postcard was from the same missionary, Brother Timmerman. My grandparents had moved to the homesteads in, I think, 1947. Granddad worked at the Oak Ridge National Laboratories. And apparently this Brother Timmerman had been to Homestead Church of Christ around 1948 to teach, talk about his mission work, and then to move on to raise support, go on to other churches, and then go back to Belgium. But while he was there, my grandmother and grandfather had taken him home to eat, fixed a big dinner. She loved to do that. Grandma loved the missionaries and the evangelists coming through. She always wanted to hear where they were from, what their work was like, and talk about all of their stories, and she'd bring them home. It was a lot of work, but she'd cook Sunday dinners and evening meals, and sometimes they'd stay with her overnight at their house and then move on to what they were doing. But that is what had happened with Brother Timmerman. And of course, the Homestead Church of Christ was, years ago, it was productive as far as sending out missionaries from there, including my Uncle David that was Grandma's son. He went to Cameroon, West Africa. There were others sending out missionaries and preachers, teachers. In fact, I found some pictures in the box of when Grandma went to Cameroon to see David. There's a picture of her boarding a Pan Am flight to London, and I don't know where it went from there, but eventually she found her way to Cameroon. There's a picture of her traipsing through the jungle with some other ladies. They were headed out to teach a ladies' class, and this was in the 1960s, late 1960s, I believe. A picture of her sitting on a big log on a huge river in Cameroon, and I have no idea where the river is, but I want to figure that out too. But missions were important. That was an important thing. But at his request, Timmerman, apparently the ladies had set about to help clothe and to help provide blankets for some of the folks in the church or the area where he was working in Belgium. And so they got busy doing what a lot of you here are familiar with, I know, and that is making quilts. And they strung quilt racks from the ceiling of the church. Of course, if you know anything about Homestead history, I think the back of that building was the weaving room originally for the back when homesteads were built. But they dropped quilt racks, made quilts, old-fashioned way. They didn't have the modern long arms and machines, but it was all by hand. Did the same thing in her house, and they sent quilts to Belgium. And to set our lesson up here, I want to read the postcard. I didn't bring it because I was afraid I'd lose it, so I copied it. It's real short. This is dated October 21, 1949. Dear Gladys and Milton, your box containing the quilt came this week, and we want to thank you for this contribution to the Belgian work. Our request for bed covers has surely met with a fine response. I am also glad to say that the economic situation here is not so critical as it was at one time, and we are thus able to devote more time to preaching the gospel. Our greatest need now is for more workers in Belgium. If you or the church there can contribute in any way to just one man to help support this work, I need assistance. Please contact Brother Daniel T. Ward, Elder, at Sherman Street Church of Christ in Denver, Colorado, who will be glad to furnish you with any desired information. As long as the work is encouraging, life in Belgium is not so bad, but we do so miss our friends and relatives in America. We surely would like to see you. Remember that pleasant day, one afternoon together over a year ago. Best regards to all. And I think it's interesting, Terry, it's addressed to 29 Grassy Cove Road. You remember, we didn't know it as Highway 68. It's Grassy Cove Road. I call this little lesson, Lessons from a Postcard. Lessons from a Postcard. The postcard teaches us that pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this: to visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. It teaches us the meaning of true religion. In this case, it was helping the very basic needs of the folks coming out of the war. What does that mean for us today? You know, when I was a kid growing up, Dad preached in a church in White County and still does. And Sunday was a long day because we got up early. And one of the things they did was to go around and pick up people who couldn't make it to church. Most of them were elderly folks who just either couldn't drive or couldn't get around very well at all, and we'd stop and pick them up. After church, you know, when I was 8, 9, 10, you know, I was ready to get home, ready to play, ready to eat something. But no, it was off to the hospital to visit. It was off to the nursing home for the nursing home service. It was taking the Lord's Supper to somebody who couldn't get out of the house, all that kind of thing. My mother helped by giving me a box of vanilla wafers that I kept in the back seat of the car. To this day, I have a neurotic connection to vanilla wafers. You know, when COVID first hit, the first thing I did was go to the local Dollar General. I bought every box of vanilla wafers they had. I really did. There's probably some 2-year-old vanilla wafers in my house today. But anyway, but I remember doing that. When I was a kid, I thought, man, this is not awful. I don't mean that, because what they were doing was a good work. It was wonderful. It set a good example. It was important. But you know how kids are. And I remember, of course, I had to share the back seat with whoever they picked up, you know. And I'm not going to say this lady's name because you may know her. and I don't want to embarrass anybody. But there was one lady we drove way out in the middle of nowhere to pick up, rural White County. And I never did like going there because I had to get out of the car, had to go with Dad, had to help her get down the stairs. But she always liked to pinch my cheeks, and I didn't like that. And so one cold winter morning, we go pick her up, and she leans down to pinch my cheeks, and she plants a big, sloppy, wet kiss right on my lips. And it warped me for the rest of my life, One of us got true religion that day, and it wasn't her, You know the kid in Home Alone that the bad guys show up and his eyes get this big, his mouth drops, he throws his hands back, and that was me on the doorstep. So don't get any ideas, guys. But what's our point here? These things are important. You learn that when you get older. There really are people in the nursing homes that need a visit. There's folks in the hospital that need a visit. There's people in our own community here that need us to go out and check on them, see how they're doing, bring things to them. It doesn't sound exciting to us sometimes. It doesn't sound important to us sometimes, but it really is. It really is, because that's part of true religion. That's part of what it's all about. That's part of what this missionary was doing in Belgium. It's part of what we need to do today. That postcard also taught us, or teaches us, that there's a role for everyone. There's a role for everyone. Regardless of our resources, we can help. You might not be able to go to Belgium to preach or teach or do what Timmerman did, but you can make a quilt. But if you can't make a quilt, what can you do? You can send a card. You can send an encouraging message. Paul teaches us in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 20 to 22, but now they are many members, but yet one body. And the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. Nor can the head say to the foot, I have no need of you. Nay, much more those members of the body which seem to be the more feeble are necessary. We're all necessary. There's always something for all of us. What else does this card teach us? It teaches us the value of Christian hospitality. It teaches us the value of Christian hospitality. The Hebrew writer says in Hebrews chapter 13, verses 2 and 3, be not forgetful to entertain who? Strangers. And why? For thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Remember them that are in bonds as bound with them, and them which suffer adversity as being yourselves also in the body. I think about this when I think about my grandmother again. You notice in his postcard he says, I remember the pleasant day together a year ago. He's probably talking about her chicken and green beans and creamed corn, But it's important. We kind of like, now you guys are hospitable. I'm not saying you're not or we're not. But you can't be hospitable enough. There's more we can do. There's more we can do. What else does it teach us? This postcard teaches us that no one is insignificant in God's eyes. And what we do for total strangers is very significant. Very significant. Matthew 25:40, and the king shall answer and say unto them, verily I say unto you, even as much as you have done it unto the one of the least of these my brethren, what? You've done it unto me. You've done it unto me. It teaches us that the work of the Lord is both benevolence and evangelism. It's not one or the other. It's not either or. I remember the old World Evangelist newspapers that used to come out. Maybe they still do, I don't know. And you'd see headlines in there, 5,000 baptized in Nigeria. Next month it'd be 8,000 baptized in Kenya. Not making light of that at all. I think that's important. But it's not just how many were saved. It's not just how many were baptized. It's not just how many churches were planted. But it's very much how many were fed, how many were clothed, for how many was shelter provided, for how many was medicine dispensed. That side of the work is just as critical as teaching the gospel. In fact, if you don't do the other, sometimes you're not going to have anybody to listen to you anyway. And that's what we need to be doing. That's what we need to be doing. It's not an either-or proposition. It's both and. Somebody I'd like to meet one day is, if I get his name right, Jose Andre. And he's the chef that has that huge nonprofit. And they go out. I remember the hurricane that devastated Puerto Rico. And it seemed like just a day or two after the thing had left the island, he's there with his big mobile kitchens. And all these cooks and chefs are there. And he's got a big pot of stew, and they're in there and they're singing. I mean, there's 100 or 200 workers, and they're singing the same songs in Spanish, and they're stirring their stew and their soup and their food. And they're feeding people by the thousands that are coming in that hadn't had a warm meal in probably 4 days. It was amazing. That's the kind of spirit we ought to have. That's what we need to be engaged in. 2 points here. Timmerman knew this. You notice in the postcard, he talks about the post-war economic conditions in Belgium improving, and that allowed him, as he says, to devote more time to preaching the gospel. You know what that reminds me of? That reminds me, Acts 6, when the apostles appointed deacons in Jerusalem. There were things that needed to be done. And the apostle said, or the verse in Acts 6 says, so the 12 summoned the congregation of disciples and said, it's not desirable for us to neglect the word of God in order to serve tables. Serving tables, in other words, the work that needed to be done is important, but we need to get out here and preach and teach. And Timmerman in his postcards kind of saying the same thing. I've been active in all this benevolent work because I have to be. People are hurting. They need things. They got to do this. But glad to tell you, things are getting better. That means I can teach more. That means we can preach more. That means, hey, I need more missionary help over here. I need some folks to come and shoulder up to this work for what I'm doing. God makes the cause of the needy his own. Okay? He is afflicted with the afflicted. And we should be too. To help others is to help Christ. In the context of Matthew 25, yes, outward demonstrations of piety are important. Yes, attending church is important. Yes, corporate worship is important. But alone, these things don't fulfill God's word. It's not just service to the Lord. It's service to men and women in the Lord's name. It's all important. What else are we taught? What else are we taught? That card teaches us that loving God and loving our neighbors are the most important goals of our lives. Jesus said, Matthew 22, 37 through 40, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like unto it. Thou shalt do what? Love thy neighbors as thyself. Love thy neighbors as thyself. In that context, Matthew tells us that a lawyer asked the question of Jesus to do what? To test him. Lawyer there just means somebody who was learned in the law of Moses, an expert in the law of Moses. Only Matthew calls him a lawyer. Mark calls him a scribe. I like Mark's translation better. Rabbinic literature debated, and still does, but back then, the relative weight of all the commandments. You know, by their count, Moses gave 613 commandments. They said 365 were negative, 248 were positive. Some were heavy, some were light. But Jesus responded with Deuteronomy 6:5. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and all thy mind. But then he adds on this, who is our neighbor? Who is our neighbor? He answers that question in Luke chapter 10 when he gives us the parable of the Good Samaritan. Our neighbor is anybody upon which we need to show our mercy. Doesn't matter if we're related to them or know them or not. Our neighbor may be thousands of miles away. But individually and as a church, Linary Church of Christ, I'm not faulting us. We need to challenge ourselves to be a good neighbor. You see, there's two things we've got to fulfill here. There's the great commandment, love God and love thy neighbor as thyself. And there's the Great Commission. And both are equally important. Both are equally important. You know, when I think about this, I can't help but think about Ukraine. That comes to my mind a lot. You see all the suffering and all the devastation over there. A lot of opportunity for the church. The church is there, by the way. And we need to support. We need to help. I remember seeing an interview on BBC, and this has been a few months ago, and they were interviewing a young lady. I don't know if she was a teenager or she was 23, 24, I don't know, but a young Ukrainian woman, and she's sitting in a stairwell after the air raid sirens have gone off, and this journalist happens to be there with her and others, and he's interviewing her. And he's asking her about, obviously, these events. The last question he asked, he asked her if she had ever seen one of the missiles in the missile barrage. And it's hard to watch, but this young lady just started shaking. She didn't say anything. She couldn't talk. She just started quivering. And tears just poured out of her eyes, and she couldn't talk. And they just kept the camera on her for a minute, and then they cut off the interview. And I couldn't help but thinking at the time, what kind of despicable regime would create that kind of fear needlessly in a young woman or anybody? And you think about that could be anybody in this congregation. That could be our children. That could be somebody in our youth group. They didn't do anything to bring this upon themselves. But my point is, and I could talk about Ukraine all day, but the point is there are needs out there. It doesn't have to be Ukraine. It can be other places. There's work to be done. You know, in the culture wars that we have in our nation today, we sometimes think that what we need are louder voices. We need sharper rhetoric. We need to be heard. We need to draw tighter ideological battle lines in what we're doing. And while there is a broad culture war going on, ultimately it's a war between good and evil is what's going on. That's footnote, okay? It's a war between God and Satan. It's a war between light and darkness. It's a war between the children of light and the children of darkness. But what we really need, and this is counterintuitive to me sometimes, to all of us, especially if you watch TV and see this stuff sometimes, but what we really, really need, we need more love. We need more good works. We need more benevolence. We need more mercy. We need more forgiveness. We need more compassion. We need more mission work. We need more quilts. We need more food. We need more water. We need more light. We need more spiritual light. This little postcard teaches us that the light from a small community of fellow Christians in Tennessee can go all around the world. Jesus said in Matthew 5:16, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." The church in Philadelphia in Asia Minor was known by its good works. John the Revelator said, Revelations 3:8, actually he's not the one doing the talking, he's doing the writing, so to speak, but he said, "I know thy works. Behold, I have set before thee an open door, and no man can shut it, for thou hast a little strength, and hast kept my word, and hast not denied my name. Ye are the light of the world," Matthew 5:14. "A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid." I even had an interesting occurrence there a couple of weeks ago. Met a new friend where they go to church, and I forget if you invited them over or you were having some conversation. They get to talking, and Avon was telling them that she grew up, or spent part of her growing up years at Linary Church of Christ. And the new friend was listening to her and said, "Linary, I know that name. I know Linary." And what had happened is this other young lady had actually worked, is it the Village of Hope? Is that what we call it? The Village of Hope, Ghana, had worked and had seen our Linary house. Village, and some of us have probably forgotten about that. Some of us here may not know what that is. But we need to remember it, and we need to put it out there. You know, your influence, your work is broad-ranging, and we need to do more of it. We need to do more of it. That postcard teaches us that there's always a harvest somewhere. John 4:35, "Say not ye, there are yet 4 months, and then cometh harvest. Behold, I say unto you, lift up your eyes." For what? "And look on the fields, for they are white, already to harvest." Timmerman in his postcard said, I'm reading his quote here, he said, "Our greatest need now is for more workers in Belgium." And what I'm asking Linary as a church, where's our Belgium? You know, those white fields change from time to time. It's wherever God works, wherever He opens hearts. And we do a lot, but I want to challenge us to do more. I want to challenge us to look outside ourselves. I want to challenge us to give more, do more, clothe more, teach more. The little postcard tells us that the Great Commission is still the Great Commission. "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be damned." And I'm asking you, do we really believe that? Do we really believe that? Because lots of times I don't think we do. Nations there, ethne in Greek, means individual peoples. It's not talking about countries particularly. But the idea is the gospel is no longer just for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. It's for everybody. And that's what he's trying to tell the 11 who are gathered there. And they didn't get the picture right off the bat. But fortunately, the Hellenistic Jews and Paul, as we have in Acts, they got the picture and they shouldered up to that task. But it's an imperative. Go into all the world. Teach. It's an imperative both grammatically and in practice. The world really does need the gospel, and they need it now. So what I'm asking you is, what are you doing? What are you sending? What needs are you filling, besides those of your own and my own? Who are you helping? Forget about yourself and look to the plight of those around you. If you need some encouragement in that way, if there's anything we could do to help anybody here, one of our own, we want to do that as we stand and sing.